Welcome back. David Hertel in for Elias. You heard this a few weeks ago. The SPVM and the SQ teamed up to combat gun violence and gun trafficking in the city ahead of the deadly gang shootings in Rivière-des-Prairies a couple of weeks ago. The SPVM also recently announced they will create a permanent squad dedicated to street gangs. In a piece that was published in La Presse over the weekend, according to Dr. Ted Rutland, an associate professor at Concordia University, this anti-gang strategy could be problematic. Joining us is Professor Rutland. Professor Rutland, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So explain to us why you find this strategy problematic.
So the Montreal police have had a street gang unit going back to 1989. In 2016, it was merged into a general anti-crime unit, and they're proposing to bring this back. I mean, they're planning to bring this back. And if you look at what's happened between 1989 and 2016, there are grave problems with focusing on street gangs. And they basically stem from the idea that in the imagination of the police, and probably the imagination of the public as well, street gang equals black man, in his teenage years or young adult years. And so in the height of the operations of the previous street gang squad, 40% of black youth in Saint-Michel and Montreal North were stopped every year. The police eventually revealed that they had the names of 10,000 gang members in their repertoire, which is an impossibly large number. And these kinds of street stops and surveillance are tied up with, racial profiling, but also police violence and killing. The killing of Freddie Villanueva and the shooting of two of his friends. That wasn't the street gang squad that did that, but it was part of the same kind of overall war on street gangs specifically.
So what you're saying actually is the what quote unquote it was called or is called the war on street gangs is actually more of a war on black young men.
That's exactly the case. And of course, I mean, there have been some shootings recently, and they should be deeply concerning to all of us. And it does seem that a lot of these shootings have been carried out by people involved in street gangs. But what I want to say is that, focusing on street gangs alone has two problems with it. One is that you end up focusing on black men who fit a certain appearance, regardless of their involvement in street gangs. So you end up stopping a whole bunch of people who have nothing to do with gangs. And you also miss the larger picture of what's driving these shootings. I think most people who understand what's happening in the northeast of the city right now will tell you that a lot of this is being fueled by higher level organized crime, including the bikers and the mafia. And so if we're focusing on street gangs alone, we're missing really key parts of what's driving these shootings. And so we care about shootings, we should care about the broader picture.
Speaking with Dr. Ted Rutland, Associate Professor at Concordia University. Dr. Rutland, I'm of the mind, because I was an M&A in Saint-Michel and for 5 years, and I was confronted to the situation on a daily basis. And one of the things that I think we don't talk enough about is just basically poverty and the economic situation of these families. They're the racialized families in the majority. I'm just thinking, what's the correct strategy? Because it makes for a nice press conference and, gets the headlines every time we do things on the law and order side. But do these moves make any type of dent in the real causes and the real situation on the ground?
No, they don't. And I think that, your involvement sort of shows that. These problems emerge from issues of poverty and racial exclusion, which police repression and the media coverage of that repression only exacerbates. Think about the difficulties that racialized people in Montreal, particularly Black and Indigenous people, have in finding good work, good employment that's going to allow them to pay their bills and feel some sense of value. All of these ideas that are being propagated by these police campaigns, that Black young men are necessarily criminals, doesn't help people get jobs. And so, anyone who looks closely at violence prevention understands that you need a whole bunch of things, and most of those involve community programs and social programs. And those include, getting people access to decent work. Mm-hmm. It also means doing community-based violence interruption, which, can involve talking to people who have been the victims of shootings, to talk to them about, the trauma that they just experienced. Mm-hmm. We have a situation where if someone gets shot and they end up in the hospital, the people that we send to care for them are the police who will ask them questions. They've just, two men in Rivière-des-Prairies were shot in that shooting that we'd often discuss. Mm-hmm. Saw three of their friends shot in front of them. And, is there anyone that's ensuring that they have the mental health care that they need? And a lot of people will argue with me and say, oh, well, they're criminals. They don't deserve our care. But it's like, if we actually care about stopping violence, we need to be able to recognize that harm often comes from previous harm. And so we need to create the situations where people can deal with the harms they've experienced and grow from that. And if we're not doing that, that we might seem like tough on crime or whatever, but we're actually contributing to its perpetuation.
So what I see is causes also, and you mentioned it. I mean, there is systemic racism going on, and we have a provincial government that denies the very existence. But other than recognizing it, I mean, if you're mayor of Montreal tomorrow, Dr. Rutland, or you're premier of Quebec tomorrow, I mean, no, but I'm trying to get to concrete solutions. You know what I'm saying? I get what you're saying. You're, and I find this very interesting. You're drawing the broad strokes. I get that. But at the same time, I'm trying to get to, okay, what needs to get done like today, next week, next month?
Sure. So I haven't prepared my mayoral campaign, but here are a couple of things we could do tomorrow, just off the top of my head, right? So we had this study recently that showed that there's massive racial discrimination happening at in borough-level employment in Montréal-Nord. Mm-hmm. We could easily do a study in Rivière-des-Prairies and Saint-Michel, in other neighborhoods, to see if that's happening as well, and repair that immediately, because those borough-level city jobs are well-paid unionized jobs. And if you've got 40 years of racial discrimination in those jobs, I mean, that's something that the government, that the mayor could easily fix tomorrow and take a lot of people out of the conditions that give rise to violence. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, we know that street workers, like travailleurs de rue, these are people who build relationships with marginalized youth and young adults, try to support them in making good lives. And that can mean many kinds of things. But those people are able to, build relationships with people who maybe are involved in a gang, and try to help them to make better choices. They get information about conflicts on the horizon that the police will never get, because street workers are independent of the police. So that they get, they build the trust of community members. Right now in Montréal-Nord, there are 2.5 street workers. Mm-hmm. Community organizations are demanding the hiring of about 12. Yeah. In Rivière-des-Prairies, there are 2 street workers working part-time. They're asking for 8. And so, if there were 2 things we could do tomorrow, those would be the 2 things. Put money immediately into hiring street workers in neighborhoods affected by gun violence, and use the power of the city government to get people good, well-paying, secure jobs.
And my last question to you, Dr. Rutland, is about defund the police. I mean, is that something to consider, or it's just putting more resources around the police, like you're saying, like street workers, community groups, economic development? Is defund the police part of the solution, in your opinion?
So I think it absolutely is. The thing is that sometimes people have an opinion about defund the police without looking at what people are proposing around specific issues. If I were to, walk down the street in Montréal-Nord or RDP and say, I think we should defund the police, I'm sure a lot of people would be opposed to it. Because what they're imagining is a sudden disappearance of the police. Mm-hmm. But when you look specifically at what people are proposing around certain issues, there's a lot to learn. And so the Defund the Police Coalition in Montreal, groups in Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and all over the U.S. have looked at, decades of research around what actually prevents violence of all kinds, including gun violence. And there are all kinds of things that need to be done that have been tried in little ways all over the place. And so, I tweet about this on Twitter pretty regularly. We do some of that in Montreal, but not very much of it. And so, yes, I think defund the police, the broad proposal of defunding the police, which is really about shifting to an economy of care and preventing harm rather than just, throwing our problems away in prison, arresting people and putting them in prison, which we know doesn't actually solve the root problem. I think that it has answers. But I would encourage people, to look at it issue by issue. So if we're talking about homelessness, what are people actually proposing there? If we're talking about gun violence, what are people actually proposing there? I think there's a lot that we could do there. And it doesn't mean, getting rid of the police tomorrow and doing nothing else. It means looking at the kind of integrated strategies that people have developed and implemented in various places, and working issue by issue to move in those directions, which have been proven to be more effective.
Dr. Rutland, I really enjoyed your op-ed in La Presse Plus this weekend, and really appreciate you coming on today to give us your point of view on this very important issue.
Thanks for covering it, and thanks for your great questions.
Dr. Ted Rutland is an associate professor at Concordia University.